apparently ruled by forces of chaos and disorder. Every day we read of new disputes and old wars and conflicts that continue to threaten global peace and security. We start with Johan Galtung, founder of the Transcend International Network in Norway.
3 points, quick succession. Point 1, you have to talk with all the parties, however unappetizing they may be. And I have an opening question, like, what does the Middle East look like where you would like to live? Second point, you look at all of their answers, and they will have formulated quite a lot of goals, objectifs in French, goals, things they want to see happen. Some of them are goals, some of them are more means. And I ask the question about legitimacy. So I come back to them and say, how do you justify that? I want to know their justification. But I myself am doing my sorting using human rights, using basic needs, and in some cases using law. But law is very often the law of the strong. And the third stage is the difficult one. For the first stage, you have to be a good journalist, a good interviewer. For the second stage, you have to know your stuff, more or less. You have to know human rights, laws, basic needs, and so on. But for the third one, you need intuition, and that is where women very often enter, as a matter of fact. And you have to be a little bit of an artist, because what it is now about is to bridge the legitimate goals. The legitimate goals. So if you have a slave who wants freedom, that's legitimate. You have a slave owner who wants slavery, that's illegitimate. But if he wants to feed his family, that's legitimate. So you may ask him, questions. Could you feed your family in some other way? Like turning your slave plantation into a cooperative or something like that. As a matter of fact, that question was asked quite often in the 1830s, 1840s. Before the Civil War broke out in 1861 to 65. So I repeat 3 stages: mapping the conflict by talking with everybody. Number 2, the legitimacy question, the justification question. And number 3, bridging legitimate goals. And for that you have to introduce some element of a new reality.
Originally from China, we speak to Tu Wei-ming, director of the Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Harvard University.
And China for the last 170 years has been very much of a learner, learning from some of the core values in the West, for example, freedom, legality, human rights, dignity of the individual, rationality, science, technology, democracy, market economy, and so forth. But China has a very long, enduring history and has generated a great deal of resources. How to learn to be human, how to be proper in not just the family, but also the neighborhood, in the broader social relatedness. China also has this idea about humanity, which can be understood as a way of not only developing one's own inner identity as a flourishing human being, but also to cultivate continuously interactive, fruitful interaction with an ever-expanding network of relationships with other people. So there's an idea of relationality, of connectivity. And at the same time, China is noted for emphasis on harmony, emphasis on the harmony between heaven and earth, but also the humanity forming one body with heaven and earth and myriad things. So I remember a beautiful quote that heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and even such a tiny creature as I finds intimacy in their midst. So all that fills the universe is part of my body, and all that directs the universe is part of my nature. And so all people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So in this sense, harmonious relationship between human beings and nature, and the fruitful interaction between self and community, and the idea of integration of the self, meaning the body and mind and heart. Another thing particularly important is the unity and mutuality between the human heart and mind and the way of heaven. So you have a very comprehensive, integrated, humanistic vision, which is both naturalistic and spiritual. Very different from the kind of secular humanism, which is anthropocentric, which is very focused on the isolated individual.
American Richard Falk is a professor of international law at Princeton University.
There are many explanations for what has gone wrong in the Middle East. They go back to the failed peace diplomacy after World War I, 100 years ago, when Britain and France pursued their colonial ambitions and created a group of artificial political communities that they called territorial states, but have never really had legitimacy as sovereign states. And we're now paying the price, I think, for this era of history that was compounded by the search for control over the oil, for the trade routes to the east through the Suez Canal, and through the grant to Israel of the right to establish a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. All these issues are part of the reason why the conflict patterns in the Middle East seem so insoluble at this point, and so much human suffering has resulted.
Walter Mignolo is director of the Center for Global Studies and Humanities in Argentina.
The main themes beyond global disorder, what is the meaning of that? The meaning of that is, if the world was always in disorder, as some people have said, we are now in a very specific type of disorder. And the way we see it is that for 500 years, from 1500 to 2000, the world order was organized, thought out, managed by what we call Western states or Western empire, from Spain and Portugal to the Dutch, to the French, to the British, to the United States. There were two wars, but those were family feuds to dispute who controlled the world, and that was successive kind of form of control. The problem now is that the West can no longer control the structure of management of world order that it created and controlled for 500 years. And why is that happening? Because the control of what we call the colonial matrix of power is being disputed. And it's being disputed by China, it's being disputed by Russia, and it's being disputed by the BRICS, and now it's coming Indonesia. Half of Latin American countries are moving in that kind of direction. So we have a conflict here between the 500-year westernization and the effort of the West, especially the United States now, to maintain control of that structure of management, and de-westernization. People have said, no, thank you, but we don't want to be managed anymore. And that is manifested economically, is manifested politically, is creating religious clashes, is creating racial conflicts, etc. So we are in a kind of really mess, and I hope, and we hope, that something different will come out of this. A lot of people are talking about a multipolar world, which means that won't be a hegemon anymore. The hegemon was Spain, and then was France, and then was England, and then was United States. China cannot be hegemon, even if, I don't think that they want, but even if they want, they can't, because the West is powerful. So what we are moving is into a kind of multipolar world, and that is the problem. How in that multipolar world that won't be peaceful transition, and that is the kind of world disorder that we are witnessing today, especially in what is called Middle East or West Asia.
Also from Latin America, Beatriz Bisio is a professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
And my research field is basically Middle East and Africa. Therefore, I presented here a speech on this issue, and I am convinced that the Middle East at the moment is the most challenged of all the problems in the present world. And as we are trying to imagine the way of having a solution for the present chaos, that was the main phrase we have to answer. I tried to remember to present some of the ideas that were discussed in a very important conference that took place in 1955 in Bandung. That was a conference that grew through the conference, and the ideas that were discussed there grew the non-aligned movement. That was a most important movement of those countries which have been recently independent to bring their message to the world in that period of the Cold War and post-World War II. What was the message of that very important part of mankind at the moment? There were the exploited by colonialism, imperialism. Do they present their ideas through a way of revenge? No. They present the way the world should act in a very interesting way. Let us respect the international law. Let us guide our steps through what the Charter of the United Nations is saying. Do we, therefore, respect the human rights, respect sovereignty, respect the non-violent way of solution of the conflicts? All these ideas at the moment seemed very utopian, but I am sure that if we try to get through this path, respect for international law, respect for the Charter, the main ideas of the Charter of the United Nations, we should have a way of thinking of a future in the Middle East, particularly through a way of non-violent solution. Let's start thinking on the solution, a fair solution of the Palestinian problem. Nowadays we speak on Syria, on Iraq, and we do really be aware of that, the solution of the Syrian crisis, of course. But the Palestinian crisis is the most, the long time, it was permanent in the long time in the 20th century, in the 21st century, and we should have a solution for the Palestinian crisis as well as the Syrian and Iraqis. And which way we can have a solution? Through dialogue and respect for their own people to solve the situation. Non-intervention is also a very important reference to have a solution for the Middle East. The aggression, the external aggression on the region is one of the main responsibilities for the present chaos. So let the people of the region, let them discuss and decide which way they are going to solution the problem. That's the way I think. Respect sovereignty, respect for human rights, but through their own way of having a solution.
So this time at the forum, I'm talking about the philosophical foundation of the China's new one belt line and one road strategy, which is proposed by China's new leader, Xi Jinping, to revive the ancient Silk Roads, to engage the countries and the regions along the old Silk Roads from central China all the way to mid-Asia and to Middle East and to Europe. And the other is to go south on the ocean, that all the way to Africa, that the ancient maritime Silk Road. And these strategies, I think, will transform the given global order. And now people are talking about the new Silk Road world order, wondering whether this will just mean a replacement of God, changing of the God, a new superpower emerging, challenging the US, and so that we have another like Cold War or even worse. But by looking at the philosophical foundation and what the Chinese government is saying, I think it will be a different kind of world order emerging. And this world order, as a Russian professor has already characterized it, it's going to be horizontal rather than vertical. The vertical world order was like a pyramid model, with the ones who has more stronger muscle, economic and military muscle at the top of dominance. This horizontal world order is an order of collaboration, cooperation. And this is displayed in many of China's leaders' talks, like Xi Jinping's new phrase that 命运共同体, that we human beings are all in a shared destiny. We cannot be better off on the basis of others worse off, because if you put the others worse off, you will be worse off also. So we have to give up the zero-sum game mentality and instead adopt the win-win kind of mentality. Try to achieve the win-win situation. And this is reflected in the ancient Chinese Confucian philosophy and also evidenced in Chinese history. Like China has never really colonized any other countries. So you can see that this culture that is behind, at least I hope, China's new one road, one belt strategy. So that's the main topic of my talk.
That's great. And really, oh yes. Could you say something about the importance of the Rhodes Forum? That's a separate question.
Okay. The Rhodes Forum is I think, a great platform for global dialogue of civilizations. It's I would say like an acupuncture point. It's located at the birthplace of Western civilization, and now it's functioning as the place where different cultures come together and discuss our common future. And that's something really great, even though the effect may be limited, but this is something definitely worth doing and worth trying. Thank you.
Finally, we talked with Simon Anholt, an economist and independent policy advisor from the UK.
We live in a very interesting point in history, a point of enormous tension, where globalization has succeeded in globalizing all of the problems so much more effectively than the solutions. So if you take any problem that might have been a rather minor problem 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, today it's become an almost insuperable problem because it's been so effectively globalized. So just to give two simple examples, if you take drug trafficking used to be a local problem that might affect one or two countries, and therefore it was well within the capability of each of those countries to stamp it out. Today, drug trafficking is a global business. It covers most of the Earth's surface, and it's consequently impossible for any single country to stamp it out. The same applies to migration, the same has always applied to climate change, to various abuses of human rights, to human trafficking, to landmines, to pandemics, to financial chaos. Whatever you look at, the problems have become globalized and the solutions have not. And the real problem is that the only power on earth that's sufficiently potent to tackle these problems, the nations, instead of collaborating together, basically spend all of their time and energy competing against each other to try and get the best deal for their own citizens. And this has got to change. I think what's really needed is a cultural change. And when I talk about a cultural change, I mean a change in the culture of governance. The basic idea of how people in positions of power and responsibility should behave. So I'm not just talking about national governments, I'm talking also about city and regional and town governments, I'm talking about the management of corporations. All of those people in positions of power and authority are still following a very, very simple old-fashioned mandate, which is that they regard themselves as being responsible for their own people and their own piece of territory. And that's the way it's always been. If we want the world to start tackling its problems, we have to change that mandate. We have to update it to what I call a dual mandate, which says that everybody in a position of power is responsible for his or her own people and for every single man, woman, child, and animal on the planet. And they're responsible not just for their own small slice of territory, but for every single square kilometre of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it. Now that sounds extraordinarily ambitious, and indeed it is, but I think that these cultural changes can and do happen quite frequently. If you look at the idea of happiness, this was an idea that came out of Bhutan just a few years ago. And up until that point, every government only ever talked about prosperity. When they were standing for election, when they were talking to their citizens, all they ever said was, we can make you richer. Then suddenly the idea of happiness came out of Bhutan, and suddenly politicians were talking about, we can make you happier. That's a huge cultural change. It took place in just a few years. Now, I have a problem with happiness. It's still basically selfish. It still basically won't solve the world's problems. So people have shifted, very importantly, from wanting to be rich to wanting to be happy. But in the longer term, we have to graduate one more step from happy to good. And that's a second cultural change, equally ambitious, but in my view, equally possible. It's obvious to me that governments are not going to make this change towards a more sustainable future on their own. They're certainly not going to do it because I tell them to. I've been trying to do that for the last 15 years, and I've had some success. But I'll be 936 before I start seeing a significant global change as a result of it. In the end, the people who run countries don't listen to independent advisors like me. Who do they listen to? Well, they listen to their own populations, of course. And not just the democratic ones, by the way. The undemocratic leaders listen to their own populations perhaps even more intently than the elected ones do. And so I think what's required here is a grassroots movement. I think we need all of the people around the world who happen to care about the world and about the whole of humanity, and are not just interested in the selfish representation of their own national interests, but want to see the world become sustainably better. They are the ones who have to talk to their governments and wake them up and say, listen, the mandate has changed. We no longer want you just to go to the G20 or the COP to get the best deal for us at everybody else's expense. We want you to go to the G20 or the COP together with all the other leaders to do the right thing for humanity. And I think that when that voice, the voice of populations, starts to be heard loud and clear, then that's the point where the leaders will change and the culture will change. When people start saying, it's no longer enough for me to live in a rich country, it's no longer enough for me to live in a competitive country, because those are old-fashioned ideas. I want to live in a good country. And when they tell their leaders that simple message, the leaders will gradually begin to change. Well, in a sense, I've already done that. Let me see if I can boil it down even more brutally. When you look around you and you read the newspapers and you see all the challenges which are facing humanity today, it looks as if we are living in an age of continuous crisis. And indeed we are. This is not an illusion. The crises are now continuous and non-stop. And this is basically the result of globalization. The problems have become very, very effectively globalized. And so it's perfectly clear that the old rule that countries are driven by a spirit of competition is no longer going to apply. That rule has been around since the Treaty of Westphalia. the idea that nation states are there to compete with each other. Back in the 17th century, they were competing for territory and for military power and for tax revenues. Today, that's considered to be bad manners, and most of the time they're competing for competitive advantage, i.e. just money. But either way, the underlying principle, the culture behind that has not changed one jot since the 17th century. Countries are still there to fight each other. And that is basically what's leading the world to disaster. Because as Benjamin Franklin said, unless we hang together, we shall most assuredly hang separately. So we need a new spirit of cooperation and collaboration in the world. The United Nations and the other multilateral institutions do their best to engender this, but in the end, they don't have a very powerful mandate, because the mandate is given to them by the governments of sovereign nations who have an interest in restricting their power. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation, which is why I believe that only populations, the 7 billion people who caused all of these problems in the first place, I believe that that's the only power available on the planet that's powerful enough to get us out of this mess.
The causes of chaos are many and varied, with a variety of external and internal factors, each of which are significant challenges in their own right. One thing is clear, and that is the need for continued dialogue and innovative thinking to lead our world towards a more sustainable and equitable future.